name's Brian Goche, and today I'm going to show you how to lay out a hip rafter. Okay? With the hip roof on this model right here, the main component of the hip roof is the hip rafter. And the hip rafter runs at a 45-degree angle from the wall plate all the way up to the center of the building, which hits the main ridge board. Okay? So the calculations that I've already calculated are basically all right here. So we are going to lay out a hip with a 16.97 slope. That's the constant for a hip, where with the common, the constant's always 12. We have a span of 29 inches, which gives us a run of 1.20833 feet. In order to get our calculated lengths for our hip rafter line length, you take the run times the hip unit line length. Gives us 23 and 13/16. And for the total hip rafter line length, which includes the projection of the house, you take your run plus projection, times it by the hip unit line length, and that gives you 33 and 5/8 of an inch. So the tools that you're going to need to lay out the hip rafter is a framing square with a rafter stick attached to it. And framing square will be set at, on the tongue of the square, your rise of 10 inches, and on the blade of the square, your run of 17 inches. You're also going to need a measuring tape and a speed square. So the first thing I'll do is take a look at our lumber and sight down the edge of it to find the crown. Okay, and I'll mark the crown just with a little eyebrow. Okay, crown is always going up for our hip rafters. So I'm going to hook my tape on the very end of at the beginning of the rafter, and I'm going to lay out my hip rafter line length, which is 23 and 13/16. Now at this point, it's very important to mark that distance on the top of the rafter, right at the corner. Okay, and 33 and 5/8 of an inch is the total hip rafter line length. So here I got my hip rafter line length, total hip rafter line length. Grab your square, making sure that it's set at 10 inches of rise, 17 inches of run. The rafter stick is going to set right on the edge of the material, and right at the corner of the material where we started the measurement, I'm going to draw a plumb line in. The tongue of the square represents our plumb line, and the blade of the square represents our horizontal or level or seat cut angle. I'm also going to come down here where we have the hip rafter line length. I'm going to draw another plumb line, and also at the very end of the rafter to do another plumb line. Now these three plumb lines are all our theoretical lengths determined from our calculations. So right up here at the ridge board, I need to do a deduction, because the theoretical line is basically where all these rafters meet in the center of the roof. So our first deduction that we're going to do is going to be half the diagonal thickness of the common rafter. So I'll slide my square on use the blade, slide my square over to a whole inch, and I'm going to deduct 1 1/16", which equals half the diagonal thickness of the common rafter. Inch and 1/16", so 90 degrees from the plumb line. Okay. Also, that hip rafter is running at a 45-degree angle from the wall plate, so I need to make a double cheek cut at the very top. So this hip rafter is 1.5 inches thick, so I need to find half that thickness, which is 3/4 of an inch, and I need to go forward on that hip 3/4 of an inch. Draw in another plumb line. This is going to be my cut line. Now at the top of the rafter, we need to transfer over that first deduction. So this line right here, transfer that over right to the opposite side, and find the center. So the theoretical length starts here, coming back, your 1 1/16" deduction gives you the point of that rafter. This is where I need to make a double cheek cut. So I'm also going to transfer across that second deduction to lay out my cheek cut on both sides. Now I can draw in those angles, connecting it from the center of the rafter to the cut line of my side cut. flipping the rafter over on the opposite side, changing my square so the plumb lines match the one on the other side, and I'm going to project that line down, which is also going to be my other cut line when I go to cut the rafter. So now that we're looking at it from the top, it gives you two 45-degree angled cheek cuts to fit inside of this connection right here. The next step of laying out the hip rafter is locating the bird's mouth. And locating the bird's mouth, we need to know a certain measurement, and that's called wood above plate. For our roof model that we built, we calculated for 2 3/4 of an inch wood above plate. So that means I'm going to have 2 3/4 of an inch above the plate measured down from the plumb line. So I'm going to slide my square over to that line, which is right at 10 inches. So I'm going to deduct down 2 3/4. So wherever I make that line right there, I'm going to draw a seat cut line in there, horizontal line, and that's going to be my bird's mouth. Now when we're laying out the hip rafter, this one we're going to drop the hip, because when the roof's plane in both right here at the hip, and it basically comes right to a point, okay? And because our hip rafter is only 1.5 inches wide, we can just simply drop the hip the distance of that corner. So dropping the hip, you want to measure back 3/4 of an inch, which is half the thickness of the hip rafter. And I'm going to draw another plumb line right there. And I'm going to mark down my 2 3/4 wood above plate again on that second line. From that next mark, I'm going to draw another seat cut line. So this one right here is my theoretical hip rafter line length, and this line is going to help locate the drop of my hip. So these two lines, the difference between them, that's the difference in height for that corner point where the two pieces of sheathing meet. So I'm going to cut this line, and by cutting that line, it's going to give me a deeper bird's mouth, which is going to drop the hip that much, so this hip rafter is going to sit so that the sheathing can come and land on the top corner of the two edges. And then I'm also going to be cutting this line right here. Always marking the lines that you need to cut so there's no confusion when you bring out the skill saw. So down here at the total hip rafter line length, I need to deduct the full diagonal thickness of my fascia board. I'm going to be using 1.5 inch material for my fascia board, so the full diagonal thickness is going to be 2 1/8. So lining up that blade with the full inch, marking over 2 1/8 inches. Making another plumb line, this is going to be the very outside corner of my hip, where the fascia board meets. Now this one here, I need to lay out a double cheek cut, just like I did up here. This one's going to be slightly different, because up here, I laid it out on both sides. This one, I'm going to lay it out all on one side, so we don't have to waste time flipping the hip rafter over and spending extra time doing that. So this one, from that first deduction, we want to go 3/4 of an inch one way or the other. 3/4 of an inch to the right and 3/4 of an inch to the left. Now I can slide my tongue across, and since the tongue is 1.5 inches, 3/4 plus 3/4, I can mark both sides of that tongue. Now when I cut this one, that first deduction is going to be the very outside point of my hip rafter tail. So I'm going to transfer that across, and I'm going to give me the center of that point right there. Now my two cheek cuts, just like the one up here, have to meet at that point. So the first one that I'm going to cut is always going to be the one that's the longest. So that's going to be this cut right here. And I'm going to label that with the number 1, because I know I got to cut that first. The second line that I did, I'm going to cut always on the waist side, and that's going to be number 2. When I have my circular saw tilted on a 45-degree bevel, I have to, it tilts to the left, so I have to come through this way to cut my first one. And as I go through that line right there and the blade cuts, it's going to cut from this point right here through the center of that center point, and this one's going to be cut full depth. And it's going to cut like that all the way through. Then I take my circular saw, go from the opposite way, cutting in this direction, and that's going to cut from this point to the center, leaving me with a point here. Everything from this point down is going to be waste. Now there's one more thing that we need to do with this hip rafter, and that's dogging it. Because the hip rafter always has to be 2 inches in nominal thickness deeper than the common rafters. So if I'm using 2x6 for my hip, 2x4 for the common rafters, the tail of the common rafters are going to be 3.5 inches. So I'm going to dog this rafter 3.5 inches down, and all this is going to get cut out. So now we have located right here for the dog, and that's going to get cut out. Once that dog gets cut out, we also need to chisel our hip rafter so it sits on the outside corner and it hugs it. So that very first line that we did here, which is the hip rafter line length, that's going to be the very outside corner of our building. So I'm going to transfer that one across and find the center of my lumber. And if I also transfer this one across on both sides, that's going to locate the side cuts so I can create this point. I would also transfer this line across, the plumb line on the opposite side, so when I chisel it out I have a line to follow, and that way it stays nice and square. Okay, so that's laying out the hip rafter. So just going over a few key points, you always want to start with crowning your lumber. Okay? Then you measure out your hip rafter line length and your total hip rafter line length, followed by 3 plumb lines. Once you get those plumb lines down, you have to remember your 1.5 inch deduction for the half the diagonal thickness of the common rafter, plus 3/4 back to locate that side cut. Over at your bird's mouth, you have a plumb line, 2 3/4 wood above plate. Then you have to move the plumb line in 3/4 inch and 2 3/4 wood above plate again. That will locate your seat cut, and it will allow you to drop your hip. The deductions again down at the fascia board is 2 1/8 back and 3/4 inch either side to locate those side cuts. Okay. After this is finished, the students will be having to lay out a hip to a tolerance of 1/16 of an inch to their calculations. Also being very accurate, laying out these deduction lines, making sure they are in the right spot so when they cut it, it ends up fitting in the house.